Good afternoon. I am Johanna, a representative from the College of Science at the University of Santo Tomas. We are second year student taking up the degree program BS Biology, major in Environmental Biology, and conducting this interview for our course in General Ecology lecture. But before we start, let me first give the floor to my group mates, who I am sure are just as excited as I am for this opportunity to introduce themselves.
It is a pleasure to virtually meet you, sir. I am Paolo Caringal. I will be Johanna's co-interviewer for today. On behalf of our group, Jacinth Amores, Desiree Amoral, Maxine Hernandez, Hazley Olimberio, Sarah Olivari, and Hannah Villasor are pleasured to have you in this interview.
Sige. Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Now that the rest of the group has finished introducing themselves, we would like to extend the same offer po to you, sir. May we please ask for your name po and your current occupation po right now?
Okay. Sige. So, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Anticamara. I'm a professor here at the Institute of Biology, University of the Philippines-Diliman, and mostly work on coral reefs and marine fisheries. So, I've been doing this since around 1990s. So, until now.
What about your educational background po? Where did you graduate po in your undergraduate po and for your doctorate po?
Okay. Sige. So, my undergrad is marine fisheries at the University of the Philippines in the Visayas, so in Miagao. And then after that, I continued with a graduate degree, a master's in biology at McGill University in Montreal, in Canada. And then after that, I work on my PhD on resource management and environmental studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And then after that, I did some postdoc, and then I came back here in the Philippines in 2010 and started as a professor at the same university where I'm working right now. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer po. Recently po, we took ecology for this year for our first semester, and we have tackled a variety of topics including ecology in different bodies of water in both marine and freshwater. We were very interested to learn the complex relationships between the organisms and the biotic and abiotic factors present in the environment. So it made us wonder, why were you interested in studying ecology? Were there any significant factors or moments in your life that made you choose this profession, like role models, inspirations, and etc.?
Uh, I think in general, since I was a kid, I'm interested in biology in general. So I remember even in elementary, high school, I'm interested in reading books about cells, tissues, and organisms, origins. And then my father almost every weekend took me to go swimming. So we lived. So we were in Mindanao. I had my elementary and high part of my high school in Mindanao, in a city called Pagadan City, and in a town called San Pablo. And so it's about 30 minutes walk to the beach. And so we do this. We walk with the dog, my brother, my sister, my mother. We always do this on a weekend, and we go swimming. And we do that even now. So when I was in high school, we moved to Cebu, and again, 15 minutes away from our house is the beach. I think na ano, since kid I was, but I think maybe in terms of really the influence and sort of what set the direction. Maybe it's my undergrad, partially my undergrad, because I decided to take marine fishery. So that was definitive. Before that, I actually passed UP, OPCAT. I actually was supposed to do business management and interior design in UP Cebu. But my cousin kind of convinced me that instead of doing that, we go because he's been studying marine fisheries in UPV instead of UP Cebu. So he kind of convinced me to, instead of pursuing interior design and business management, go to UP Visayas. And the most influential person I think that kind of solidified my work was my supervisor for my my master's and my PhD. So Dr. Amanda Vincent, she was a professor at Oxford, and then so she had some project here in the Philippines, and so I was working with her in the Visayas in series of projects in central Philippines. There are a lot of islands there. It's part of the Nahon Double Barrier Reef, and so she kind of engaged me in many of conservation work on marine protected areas, seahorses, things like this, and I get to interact with many of her students from. She had several students from Cambridge and Oxford coming here, and I get to interact with them, and that's why I think that one also made me decide further to really just continue and work on conservation and yeah.
In all careers po, there are bound to be obstacles. Biology is notoriously known to be an academically rigorous course. Has your experience as a ecologist or scientist been mostly positive or negative? And why do you think so po?
Mhm. I kind of never really look at it as I kind of positive and negative um, thing. I'm aware that in the kind of work I'm doing, especially for coral reefs, it's it's more challenges than victories, right? So like I think whenever you go to a fishing community, the problem never ends, kind of, so even even the areas where we kind of worked for a very long time since around 1997, we worked with the communities, we worked with the local government. There's always new challenges. So for example, even if you have been successful in managing a protected area for, let's say, 3 years, 5 years, and you develop all the maybe collaborations, the policy. In the Philippines, when there's a change in local government, so for example, mayor change, the governor change, the congressman change, everything change. So then you have to sometimes start from the very beginning, and then yeah, so then you have typhoons, like so you have these protected areas, and then they get wiped out by typhoon, then almost like restart again. So I think it's um, I think overall this kind of work, and I think life in general, I think is very dynamic, right? So it's in the sense that it's dynamics, like nothing is the same as every day, right? And you can never expect to never run into challenge. So even if you're working in it for a long time, you have to expect that maybe somewhere along the way and a new challenge will arise. And so it doesn't have to be positive or negative. It's just that this kind of challenges. Being a scientist, I think that the major role is to always think and come up with a solution, and that will never stop because there's always new problem coming in. So I guess that's my take on it, right? Like I don't see it. Yeah, yeah.
Sir, despite the challenges po in funding and yung risk nga po and you describing life being dynamic pa in general, how do you stay motivated po? Like why do you still pursue your interest po?
For me, maybe the motivation come from actually seeing the coral reefs, the status and reefs becoming empty, seeing the community really in great poverty. So I think yeah, maybe if you expose yourself um, to some of the realities, maybe you get scared, but also maybe you can actually get inspired that maybe a meaningful life in a country like a Philippines actually trying to help some of the major problems, because at the end of the day, if the problem continues, we can ignore it, but actually it impacts all of us in the long run, because it creates a country, right? So no matter how good your condition is, if the entire country is suffering, you're still part of a country that is suffering. So I guess for me, the motivation is um, maybe it's not negative sense that you focus on seeing the problem, because maybe some people in the country who focus on seeing the opportunities, right? Creating big businesses. That's also one option, right? And maybe when you create big business, you can actually help a lot of people by employing things like that, right? But still, I guess that's the short answer to what motivates me. trying to find solutions to some of the problems that I see and I experience.
After thoroughly reading your research article po, we came up with a few questions regarding what you observed po during and after the conduct of your study in the impacts of Super Typhoon Yolanda on Philippine reefs and communities. Firstly po, you conducted surveys for the quantification of Yolanda's impacts on coral diversity and reef fish diversity. What specific reefs po and fishes were most commonly washed out by the typhoon Yolanda po?
So 3 days before Yolanda happened, I was actually doing field work in that area as part of my national coral reef survey. So when you are there in this area in Giwan, Eastern Samar, and these areas, usually you don't have phone signal and you don't have internet. So and what we usually do, we just drive to go to these places because oftentimes when you go to these places there are no scuba tanks, scuba gear. So we have to carry our own scuba gears and scuba tanks. When we arrive is the when Yolanda hits the area where we were just doing the survey. So what happened there for immediately after that typhoon, my brain was just running that I need to see what happened to the area where I just recently did some survey. So the first I went, so I was just snorkeling basically that time. So to answer your question, I didn't really see fish being washed out, but what I saw immediately, because that was a few days after Yolanda when there was a flight from Manila to Tacloban. Um, what I saw was that majority of the corals get broken, but immediately I think what happened is that the broken corals, it depends on the shape of the coral. So the branching ones, they were all broken into pieces, and the ones that are shaped like a boulder, if they were on a slope, because underwater is kind of like a mountain, everything is kind of a hill. So if the reef is kind of a steep slope, then all those boulders are being rolled down by the typhoon. So you will see them at the kind of the bottom. They're piled up, and then the rest are just broken into pieces. The corals that are left standing, when they are kind of broken or abraded, immediately they were covered with green algae. So you don't almost recognize the broken pieces because there's so much. I think what happened is that when the typhoon steered the sediment, it kind of freed the nutrients and then therefore encouraged the algae to grow. So there's so much algal growth immediately after. So it's usually green algae. And then the fish, I think because many of the fish that are dependent on corals for food, like the butterfly fish, they probably just disappeared. Like I couldn't see them. The fish that I saw um, that were kind of thriving after the typhoon were the ones that would like to eat algae because there's so much algae. When I was doing the survey, even before Yolanda, the areas where we surveyed are really depleted of fish. So there's not a lot because there's too much fishing, and in fact, there are some dynamite fishing in some of the areas, and I've seen the dynamite fishing operations. And so there's a lot of dynamite. In fact, you can see definitely that the corals are being destroyed by Yolanda because of the very strong force, and that has an impact. Therefore, and from changing the actual coral composition to the shift in the dominance of algae, that has a consequence on the fish that thrive in those area in the next few months when I was doing the successive survey. So after that first flight with PAL, I kept coming back and monitored the areas, and I saw that for at least a year, the herbivore fish were very happy because of the many algae. And the algae was changing from initially it was mostly green algae, and over time the green algae disappeared and it was followed by the brown algae. So there was this kind of a series of change in dominance.
In relation to the previous question, from your surveys, it can be observed that benthic organisms, corals, and reef fish were severely impacted by Yolanda. After their after the recovery from the typhoon, Were there any significant changes in terms of their nutrition and behavior?
I don't think Yolanda changed the the nature of the fish. They are still the same nature. They still herbivores, etc. What happened is that some of them have lost their resource. Like for example, the corallivore, those that needs to eat coral polyps because most of the corals are dead. Then they could be wiped out. I don't really know exactly why. I don't know because I haven't really documented. They just not many there when I was doing the survey, and all that's left are mostly the herbivore, and then the benthic because they still allow worms. They can still survive, but these are mostly small fish. Um, in to begin with, there's not a lot of predatory fish even before Yolanda, so I don't think I can say that Yolanda had impacted that. The feeding behavior of the fish, I think, are very established. So they're the same. It's just that the resources have changed after Yolanda for many of the fish.
From your graphs po in your reef sites before and after Yolanda po showed a decline in coral species richness and Shannon's diversity po. What are
Hmm.
your prediction po on how coral species richness will change in the following years po, especially na yung number of typhoons that have occurred po since Yolanda po?
I would say that some some of the um, maybe the corals in areas that are kind of flat, not slopey. Maybe there will be chance for some of the corals to start recruiting and then maybe establishing. But for the coral reefs that are kind of slopey, because there's a lot of rubble, so if the baby corals will settle, they'll usually with the change of tide and the change of current, these babies cannot really flourish, cannot reestablish themselves. So I think the recovery will be less in this area because the rubble is very very unstable. So if we don't stabilize them, there's not a lot of hope for natural recruitment of corals in this area. So I say that it's very difficult to see recovery in some of these areas with many unstable rubble and being very slopey because the current can be strong in some of these areas. So ganun yung mga nakikita ko na na patterns and trend. So when we actually have another project um, to survey the area like maybe a year or 2 years after the Yolanda. So parang ganun yung nakikita ko that because there's not a lot of fish, then the algae just continued, and so that I didn't see a lot of coral recovery. So parang ganun yung nakikita ko. So I guess yun if we want to really actively recover the areas, we need to understand yung trophic dynamics ng area, and then also we need to understand how we can help the coral recruit, for example, like that. So without doing anything, and instead of doing something to assist the corals recover, reestablish, and instead of assisting the fish to recover, we just keep on fishing unlimited and unregulated. Then I think the degraded status of the coral reef will just be sustained for a long time. Sige.
In your study po, it can be noted that Sargassum species was the dominant macroalgae in reefs po that exhibited high macroalgal cover po. If this macroalgae persists on reefs po, will this cause negative effects po on our environment in the long run po?
So I think that sargassum themselves have a certain kind of seasonality. But what I notice is that kung wala na nga yung wala nang magko-control sa growth nila. So the fish are gone that will eat the sargassum. Then you will find that many of the what used to be a coral reef dominated system will become suddenly a sargassum dominated system. So I think we need to understand what controls the sargassum. Why is it that healthy reefs are being maintained healthy and the sargassum cannot outnumber the corals themselves? But why is it in some situations when there's a change in the fish community, somehow the sargassum thrive and then kind of exclude basically the corals themselves. So in the case of Yolanda, I think what happened is yung sinabi ko kanina na it started with the green algae and then later on the brown. So part of the brown algae that were kind of becoming dominant were the sargassum. But without the control, definitely what will happen is that sargassum starts eating the area where that used to be dominated by corals. Yeah.
Based on the results you obtained, it was clear that the increase in fishing pressure is one of the main causes of damage to corals and the decrease in fish production. If given a chance, how would the localities be a great help for the recovery of coral reefs to be conserved and protected in current times?
For me, I believe that at the end of the day, the people who really kind of interact with the reefs, the fish, the corals, are the fishers. The people who really use the reefs as part of their livelihood. So yun, so they should play a really important role in terms of managing, trying to understand, kasi nobody else has a good grasp of what's going on with the reef other than the people who survey the reef. So yun, so una muna tingin ko napakahalaga ng role ng mga fishers and how we can empower them to be part of the management. The government needs to support the management. And so by offering I think the fishing communities some alternative. But I think the major question in most of the government and then conservation groups in the Philippines is what are these alternative? You know, how can we provide them alternative when they just want to go fishing? If you give them a project, they will ask for a boat, they will ask for a fishing net. And but I think that's not true. That if you really talk to the fishers, some fishers they don't want net, they don't want boats. But I guess it becomes a after Yolanda, definitely what happened. There's millions and millions and probably billions of money for trying to help from international communities, from the local people, from the Filipinos, trying to help communities impacted by Yolanda. You know, like a coral reef, a healthy society would require every single human being doing something different from each other, maybe, or if they do roughly the same thing, there must be something different. Everybody lose. So I think that there has to be a reframing of how to build a sustainable economic community in the Philippines. Try to think how everybody can win or how everybody can lose in a situation. So ayun. So every decision that every single person do will have an impact to everybody else. And at the end of the day, seems like the optimal scenario for many is to have more like cooperation and less competition.
Sir, so for in order po to prepare and prevent significant losses po, are there conventional models po to predict how typhoons might impact coral reef communities? And do you think there is a room for improvement for these models po?
Typhoon themselves are somewhat if you notice they change their path, they change their strength, change their yun, parang it's a very dynamic. So maybe if there is a model, it will just give us a so all sorts of models are simplification of the real thing. So it's really the the purpose of the model is kind of in general it kind of provides us some ability to ask questions. The models are usually developed as tools for the scientists to refine and try to understand what's going on. I think na uh, in general, I say na siguro simplistically, any based on what I saw, any island coastal area in the Philippines that will be impacted by a super typhoon like Yolanda will experience some coral degradation depending on the depth of the coral reefs, the slope of the reefs, the composition of corals, etc. So the various combination of this. So as I said earlier, a super strong typhoon like Yolanda, once it hits a slopy area with lots of boulder shaped corals, then all these boulder shaped corals will be tumbled down, goes to the bottom of the ocean. So I think that this I can sort of vouch that it will happen if there's a super typhoon. So in my mind, this is just my mental model based on what I saw. This is what's gonna happen. Every time there's a typhoon, this will be the response. And then once these reefs are broken, immediately they will be covered with algae. So I guess yung parang ganun yung general sense ko ng what will happen every time there's a typhoon. So meaning that if there's a super typhoon happening in a coastal area with mostly fishers, I don't think really it makes sense for non-government, NGOs, civil societies to go out there, give money, and give more fishing boats.
Our environment and climate changing ever so rapidly, we are forced to adapt to these changes and study the said changes. With that, what are your plans going forward, and if there are any, and if you're willing to do so, can you name studies that you're currently working on and why you chose to work on them?
Um, as I said, I see myself working siguro next 15 years, no, and then I'll retire. So parang ganun, no? And so I think that I would like to use that next 15 years really trying to devote trying to understand how you can recover these degraded areas. And para sa akin yung equivalent is like when a human being is very sick with cancer and all those sorts of disease, then the way biology address this is developing all sorts of technology and cure to help solve the problem. What would it take for a reef that is now declared 5% only, or which is an outdated estimate, 5% only healthy? What would it take for a country that's losing 80% of its forest, not accounting for grassland, etc.? And then there's 100 million more Filipinos, probably will be worse than what we are experiencing. So parang ganun yung nakikita ko in the next, by then I'll be retired. No? So this is a question that matters more to those who will be starting still their career, starting to build their life, and hoping to have a good life. Yun, parang yun, it's a very important quest. But for me, even though I will be retiring in 15 years, I still think it's the most important question. Ecosystems, biodiversity, these different kinds of other life, non-human, underpins all economic activities, all economic development. Lahat ng pera na generate mo, napunta sa wealth mo, napunta sa bank account mo, this all comes from nature. Hindi to magic, no? It doesn't come from nothing, comes from nature. So therefore, the biggest question is how can you make sure nature produce all this wealth for people? So yun siguro dapat yung next generation ng mga scientists at uupo sa mga government, they should prioritize biodiversity. Yun, sana mawala na yung mindset na bangus tilapia lang, parang ganun, no? Makikita mo daming card illustrations, no? Subukan naman bangus tilapia, parang ganun. Maybe subukan naman biodiversity, no? Parang ganun, maintaining biodiversity, parang ganun. Maintaining naman, subukan naman na babalik ang mga forest, ang coral reef. Subukan naman na bumalik yung healthy na ilog, buhay na ilog rather than patay na ilog. Ayun.
It was truly an honor po to listen to your insights and dive deep into your publication po. With all that we've learned from you po, as students, we are both excited po and anxious for the future that awaits ahead of us. So for our last question po, as someone who has been working in the field of ecology for years now, what would be your advice for us po students who are aspiring to become environmental biologists? Like, what should we expect sa fieldwork? Ano po dapat yung paghandaan po namin?
Message ko siguro sa mga biology students, sana yung seryosuhin na there's that opportunity. So if you go to business, then you do everything you can to make a good business environment in the Philippines. If you go to engineering, make sure na lahat ng building ay hindi babagsak pagka may lindol kasi we are in the ring of fire. So if you're a biologist, you have to make sure na you contribute to solving some of the biological environmental problems of the Philippines. Dapat ganun. Hindi yung at the end of the day, biologist ka, lahat ng biologists mapupunta lang sa I think important na may mga medical doctors, no, parang napaka-important. Pero sana hindi 90% ng 95% ng biologists. Kasi kaya sa parang kung konti nga lang nagba-biology saka nag-environmental science ta's mapupunta pa sila lahat sa microbiology lang, parang gano'n na ano na field or parang napaka-narrow lang. Ang ibig ko sabihin na parang sa ngayon dapat you need to understand ano nga ba ang biology sa country at ano nga ba ang impact niya sa society. So yun, ano nga ba ang biology sa Pilipinas? Yun, parang gano'n na sa science as an applied science, ano naging impact niya sa country. So yun, lalo na pagdating sa environmental degradation, parang ganun. So I guess, at the end of the day, it's really what kind of contribution you wanna make to the country, to the people, yun, to the planet, to the environment. So yun, parang yun lang yung basic question siguro. Ayun, yung advice ko. So, ano yung impact that you want?
Sir, thank you po for giving us your time to participate in our interview. It was very
Mm.
insightful po, and help us gain a bit more of wisdom and appreciation po for your work and for all the ecologists in the world po.